Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. We're glad you could join us for our Lunch and Learn book chat as Bernie Sieracki shares his findings for his soon-to-be-published book, Attempting Democracy. You'll learn about the most consequential election in the history of the state of Illinois, which took place nearly 200 years ago. In fact, August 2nd, 1824 to be exact. Our presenter, no stranger to the sometimes rough and tumble world of Illinois politics. Bernie Sieracki was an Illinois lobbyist for 40 years. He received his PhD from the University of Illinois, Chicago. Upon retirement, he taught as an adjunct professor at UIC. He's the author of A Just Cause, the Impeachment and Removal of Governor Rod Blagojevich, and is currently finishing Attempting Democracy about the Illinois legislature in the 19th century. Of course, after his presentation, we'll open it up for some Q&A. For now, as we approach that 200th anniversary of the election that would determine if Illinois became an unrestricted slave state, along with the colorful characters involved in that election and the future consequences for Illinois regarding slavery, please welcome to the ALPLM, Bernie Sieracki.
Thank you. I decided to take a chapter of my book and do an article and condense it into an article. And I think it's probably one of the most interesting but unknown factors about Illinois politics in the 19th century. I'd like you to, if you would for a moment, to go back with me and try to imagine Illinois in 1819. Now, we all have the rail splitter images that we think about Abe Lincoln, but Illinois represented opportunity. And it was at a time that something called democracy was beginning. I'll say that again. Democracy was beginning. John Marshall, Chief Justice, asked him, and many of the founders, John Marshall said, the difference between a republic and democracy, a republic is order. Democracy is chaos. And yet, self-ruled democracy, private people governing themselves, was very, very new in the world, and it was very new in Illinois. So what you have is a situation where you have tremendous opportunity, land, and you have absolutely limited government. And so people came to Illinois, rushed to this state, basically for the opportunities. And one of the opportunities at the time was slavery. Missouri, if you look back to the Missouri Compromise and the Missouri, when they entered the Union, opted to go to slavery. Illinois did not. Illinois had a problem developing a constitution to be accepted by Congress. That was basically what they did when they drafted the first Constitution. The first Constitution, the people that drafted it wanted it to be non-controversial, just make us a state, and then we can do whatever we want. And so they took language from the Illinois Territory, the Northwest Territory language, and basically put in it that slavery was forbidden in Illinois. But if you entered slavery by consent, and that's what the Constitution says, then you simply gave up your rights to be a free citizen and became a slave. And you could do that. Now, you have to say, what the heck would anybody want to do that for? Well, if you were a black in Illinois, and this white fellow said, look, you either sign this or I'm going to sell you down to Georgia or Carolina or someplace like that, you would sign. And so now we didn't have a lot of black people in Illinois in 1818. The numbers I see are less than 1,000. So maybe the population of Illinois, if you believe the census that the drafters of our Constitution in 1818, if you believe them, we had 40,000 people. I wouldn't believe them. They counted people twice. There was just nobody. There was very, very sparse population. Of that population then, probably about 900 that I can come up with. There were 900 black people in Illinois in 1818. So there wasn't a big, but the people that drafted the Constitution were there to make money, and I'll go into some of them for you in a little bit. But they basically said, we'll put this is the language from the Northwest Territory. Congress won't have a problem with it. We'll use that. We'll become a state, and then we'll make ourselves totally a state, a slave state, with no restrictions. And that was basically the plan. We became a state. We say in Illinois that Illinois became a state in 1818, but the legislature didn't meet. And, the first legislature actually met before we were a state. In December of 1818, Congress said, boom, you're a state. In January of 1819, the legislature met for the first time as a governing body of the state of Illinois. And the first thing they did, one of the first things they did, was pass what they call the Black Law, the Illinois Black Law. If you read the Illinois Black Law in the statutes, it was a system of total deprivation of blacks. The law specifies how many, they called them stripes in those days, lashes, stripes, how many stripes they would give for certain offenses. Being lazy, 10 stripes. Talking back. If 3 blacks congregated at one time, I'm just giving you some of the parameters of the law, if they were together, 3 of them, they would get stripes for that. There was no, talking back, being lazy, this was all in the law. They passed it, boom. And Governor Shadrach Bond, who was our first governor, notorious pro-slavery guy, I can't say that enough, signed it. And his son, by the way, if I can digress for 1 minute, was a carpetbagger in the Civil War. So Shadrach Bond III was his son. That was the situation. In 1819, in 1820, 21, this is opportunity. I won't go off on a tangent here, but one of the perceived opportunities was the banking system. Because if you can imagine, this new democracy, this self-ruled democracy, we didn't have a money system. We used species. Some historians have said we traded elk skin for this and that, and that's probably about right. So they developed a banking system in Illinois in 1820s, 1821, that was a total sham. We would say today, my God, wait a minute. And they made themselves, the legislature, the regulator of the bank, they gave themselves loans, just legislators, or if you knew somebody, maybe if you were a lobbyist like I was, and they would, it just totally bankrupted the state. There was no money. Things were bad, and then top it off. There's a depression or a panic, they called it, in the total United States in 1819, the Panic of 1819. So financially, we were in a very bad situation. And the legislature simply said, people in the legislature, you know, if we had slavery, this land would go skyrocket. We could make some money. The biggest industry in Illinois in 1821, 22, 23 was land speculation. Everybody speculated land. And so they said, slavery will help that. So the condition simmered in the legislature. And along comes a fellow named Edward Coles. Shadrach Bond, by the way, was not elected governor. He was appointed governor. Okay, the legislature, when they first met in 1818, they appointed him the governor. So he was fairly uneducated. He was literate, but he was not a very bright guy. He was a relative of one of the clerks during the Rangers War, during the 1812 war, who came to Illinois, went home and went back east and said, Shadrach, you ought to go there. You could make some dough. Came to Illinois, got along with everybody. They made him governor. And you must realize that being governor in at the beginning of the state, was a very weak position. We developed the governorship to be not very powerful. We didn't want a king anymore. This is new democracy. This is self-rule democracy. This is people doing things on their own. So it was kind of well, along comes a fellow named Edward Coles. And let me just take about 2 minutes and talk about Edward Coles. He was the son of a revolutionary individual, and that formed basically kind of a revolutionary aristocracy in that period. He was a cousin of Dolly Madison. So he knew Dolly early on. He became the secretary to James Madison when James Madison became president. And he honed some skills that were, for that time, very advanced politically. He could wheel and deal. And decided to check out Illinois, this place called Illinois, and Kentucky, and Indiana. And he was looking around to find a place to settle. And he came out here and he bought several hundred acres around Kaskaskia. And Nicholas Biddle, who, those of you, is a fellow that became the vice president or the president of the Second United States Bank. For those of you who are familiar with Andy Jackson, there was a real tension between Biddle and anyway. Biddle and Edward Coles were pretty good buddies, and Biddle said, "Come on back here. You know what to spend your time in Illinois. This is you." And so he did. And he went back east, and James Madison had a problem, a real serious problem. The Russian ambassador was arrested for raping his maid, his household maid. And he was arrested. Well, the Tsar had a fit. You can't arrest the ambassador. And this was going on. So there was tension. So Madison said to Coles, go to Russia and see if you can work this out. And Coles said, I don't want to go to Russia. He said, no, I really need you to do this. Well, he did. Coles consented. He went to Russia. He worked it out with the Russian Tsar. On the way back, he took what is called the Grand Tour in the 19th century. He toured France. He toured England. And while he was doing that, he made some tremendous contacts with people. Here's the representative of the President of the United States. And two of the people that he met were a fellow named George Flowers and Michael Brickback. And they were Englishmen. They were classically educated. And I want to stress that point. It's probably a personal point with me, but they were people that were of the upper class that would read the Roman and the Greek philosophers and the English philosophers and the French philosophers. They'd read John Locke. They'd read people like that. They had the time to do it because they were wealthy. And both of these characters, Flowers and Brickberg, went to Europe, decided what can we do about this. Now remember, Europe is boiling at this point. They don't explode until the 1840s, but this was kind of And anyway, Coles met them. And of all people who introduced him to Coles was John Quincy Adams, who happened to be, by the way, over there. So, and Coles said to them, you gotta come, you're the type of people that we want to come to the United States. They came to the United States, eventually made contacts with Jefferson, and just unbelievable who they made contacts with. Eventually moved to Edwards County, near the Wabash, and what is now Edwards County, and started something called the English settlement. So there was probably about 900 people living in that area that was known as the English settlement. I tell you that because simply that was. Coles renews his acquaintance with these fellows and then decides to run for governor. And this is 1822. And he wasn't really liked very well. Coles was here in Illinois when he first came, when he bought his land, and was actually an observer of the 1818 Constitution. So he watched these people. And he decided he was going to take his slaves, move to Illinois, and did that, and sold all the land, and upset his family to no avail. But came to Illinois, did something before he got here that is very interesting, and labeled him forever. He got his slaves together on this ship, on this barge really, and said, you know what? You are all free. And they went, oh no, whoa, what? No, I'll help you, but that's it. And he freed all his slaves. He had about 30 people. So you can imagine this. Comes to Illinois. He's an observer of the Constitutional Convention. His mannerisms were not the best. He wasn't a very good PR person. He always talked about his contacts in Washington and the people he knew. And well, these are a bunch of rednecks from Illinois, and they just didn't like that. And he wasn't married. And they decided, we don't like this guy. It's gonna, Besides that, he freed his slaves, so he was anti-slavery. And anyway, back to his campaign. He gets elected. He has two major pro-slavery people running against him. They kind of split a vote. He got there was actually a fourth candidate. He got about 500 votes, but everybody else. And Coles won by 167 votes. Now, you know, imagine what Donald Trump would do with 167 votes. You know, but so he won the election. And his first speech in the legislature in December of 1822, he called for repeal of the 1819 black laws and called for the institution of banning slavery forever. The legislature went crazy. They couldn't believe this. It's like a bomb. One historian has said it was like a bolt of lightning on a clear summer day, which is kind of a nice way to put it. What to do? They decided they were going to investigate the governor's speech and have a review of it and issue a report. And so the Senate appointed 5 people. The House had an election for people. They came up with a report from the Senate that was just what the Senate leaders wanted, just condemned Coles, condemned the report, or condemned his speech, and decided that the report suggested, it's in the archives, that they hold a convention and modify the convention. Now, they didn't say to institute slavery. What they said was there's problems in the convention, or in the Constitution. It's inadequate. The 1818 Constitution is inadequate. We're going to change that. And it's, darn it, this is America. This is new democracy, self-democracy. Everybody can do this. And we have a voice, and we're going to do it. And the people are going to do it. They really wanted to do was have a convention, modify the convention as in reference to slavery. They could have changed these other things, and that would have been it. That was the whole idea. And they came up with the report. The Senate report, as I said before, was just exactly what the legislature wanted. The House report surprised everybody because they had former slave owners on the House report, or on the House committee. They issued 2 reports. One said, no, it was a very good speech. The others gave them exactly what they wanted. So they took the Senate report and they developed a joint resolution calling a convention at the next general election, which was, this is in 1823. The next general election is August 2nd, 1824, 18 months later. So they respond with a resolution. Now, the resolution has got to be passed by both the House and the Senate. It's a joint resolution. And it takes, by the Constitution of 1818, it takes 2/3, not just simple majority, 2/3. The Senate overwhelmingly approved it. The House, the leaders knew they'd be close. Because there's some anti-slavery people here, you know. If we can move them, I don't know. You know, we can trade. Log rolling, everybody familiar with that term? Means I'll help you build your house. We'll roll the logs together. You help me build my cabin. It's reciprocal. We'll do a little log rolling with that. They were 1 vote short. One of the people that is an interesting character is a guy named Nicholas Hansen. Nicholas Hansen was from Pike County, which is north of here, northwest, and I think north. Anyway, it's the old military track, brand new county. There was a fellow in Pike County by the name of John Hanson. There was a fellow named Shaw, and Shaw was a riverman, meaning an old keelboat operator, tough, no education, alcohol problem, by all reports. And he owned a tavern called Shaw's Tavern. And Hanson was from New York, so he was a New Yorker, but he was fairly bright and fairly aggressive also, by the way. I don't want to say Hanson was fresh of breath air in Illinois. I mean, he was pretty much, he knew how to wheel and deal. And to make a long story short, Hanson and Shaw run for state representative. Shaw loses, but and the way the numbers of that are just, I mean, you can't believe that. Shaw had his own election. He had, at his tavern, by the way. And lo and behold, Hanson didn't get one vote. He got all the votes. And there was, rumors that people would come from Missouri across the Mississippi and drink and then vote for Shaw and then go back. And that was what elections were in 1821, 22. Hanson was also very bright. He was an attorney. He came from, and an attorney, I mean, I have to demodify that a little bit, or to explain that a little bit. Didn't mean he necessarily went to law school. It meant he studied law under somebody or at a law office. They used Blackstone's treatise as a substance, and then they gave him a test. Well, if you knew the guy, so now you can practice law. Hanson was, but Hanson had a lot of friends in Pike County also. And the election was challenged. In those days, the legislature decided elections. They looked at challenges. You didn't go to court. You went to the legislature. And they figured, well, who's going to serve us better? They decided Hanson would be the guy. And so they sat him. Shaw just was beside himself. Shaw pushed he was very good, and he gave them what they wanted. Originally, their decision was upheld. Hanson gives us everything we want. They had elected that guy over in the corner, over in the far side of the screen, Jesse Thomas. Jesse Thomas was adamant pro-slavery. Jesse Thomas wanted to be senator. Hanson voted for Jesse Thomas. They said, good man, we made the right decision. Hanson was rewarded. He was made a board member to study this new concept of an I&M canal. There's a salary with that. He was given an allocation for his district. He was helping him along. He was helping us. We were helping him. Right? The Constitution comes about, and the resolution comes about, and lo and behold, Hanson votes against it. And they are stunned. So, what they did was quickly, and they, by the way, they had some indication that he was going to do this, but it still was kind of like, holy cow. And so they reopened the investigation, the election investigation. They reopened it again. So wait a minute, we didn't know this stuff before. And the argument was extremely, one guy said, well, I think I think he didn't get all the votes that he was given. I mean, seriously, it's about that heavy. They said, you're right, Shaw's the guy. They replaced Hanson with Shaw. Shaw gets sworn in, takes the first vote is the Constitutional Convention call. He votes with it, they have it. They have 2/3. They pass it. And so, now, that started 18 months of an absolute, some have called it the most violent campaign ever. I'll get into that. It was just an amazing time. This is something that both sides, the people that were pro-convention and the people that were anti-convention, later called the conventionalists, or the Slavery Party, and the Freedom Party. All right? The Freedom Party, they both issued a statement. So there was, and what's amazing about this time is that they are so sophisticated in some of the things that they do, and so primitive in other things that they do. It's hard to believe just to reconcile these things. But they both realized, both sides, that the culture that was prevailed in Illinois at that time. And of course, the pro-convention people, the slavery people, said, this is democracy, this is our right to have a convention, our Constitution is flawed, we need to fix it. And those people that don't want this to happen, they're doing it for themselves. They're trying to make money off of this. They're the guys. We have the right to make our own laws. We're the people. The Freedom Party, and by the way, articulated that yes, you have the right. We're not going to argue that. Not going to argue that at all. All the rights, we have the greatest system in the world. But, and they argued the humanitarian aspects of slavery. And they argued that these guys just want this convention so they can change it and make this a slave state. And that was basically the arguments. Now, and by the way, as I say in the slide, the conventionalists did not mention slavery one time in their review of what they were in their position. Didn't mention it at all. The Freedom Party totally mentioned slavery. That was the only thing they really focused on. That while agreeing with the people, that was the only thing that they focused on. Those arguments pretty much did not change for 18 months. As soon as the convention was passed, convention resolution was passed, Coles immediately sprang into action. He and started talking to people. The first two people that he talked to are Morris. Let me see if we can do this again here. Morris Birkbeck and Richard Flowers and a fellow named John, and I'll talk to you about them in a minute. Coles contacted them. The letters that they exchanged, believe it or not, are preserved. They're in a book by Clarence Alford, about 1897 edition of it. And I've got the book for it after this lecture, if you'd like to. But Coles contacted them and said, I want you to help me. He also contacted his contacts in Washington, Nicholas Biddle, for one, actually Philadelphia, And Biddle totally agreed with him, but he didn't have any time to help him because he was just then taking over as president of the Bank of the United States. So he said, "I'll tell you what I'll do. Get in touch with this guy named Robert Vaux, V-O-U, I don't have him up there, but V-O-U-X. And he's wealthy, he's educated, and he definitely is anti-slavery, and so Biddle facilitated a meeting between these two people. Vaux was very, very anxious to get involved and help him, and Coles gave him some advice. He said, and basically with printing pamphlets that could be distributed, and Coles said that would be very, very helpful, but I'll tell you what, don't bring pamphlets around here that are made in another state, or someplace like Philadelphia, all right? Because the people in Illinois they just don't like to be told what to do. They don't like outsiders telling them what to do. Coles agreed. He agreed to remain, and so they became very good friends, Coles and Robert Vaux. And in fact, such good friends, little side note, Coles returned eventually to the East and met a lady named, I think her name was Rebecca Vaux, and Rebecca and Edward Coles were married. So he married his cousin. Another fellow that I will talk to you about is Peck. John Mason Peck. John Mason Peck, and I want to go on here, was a minister. He was from the East. He also was an educated person, and if I can go off for a moment, ministers were of two different types. There was the fire and brimstone. This was the time of the Second Great Awakening. And, okay, thank you. And again, if you take a look at the Second Great Awakening and take a look at self-rule democracy happening at the same time, they really reinforced each other. The Second Great Awakening said, I don't need you, meaning some minister, to save my soul. I need to communicate with God. I can do it. The Reformation, going back to Luther riding his horse around Germany, challenged the aristocracy of the church at that time. The self-rule democracy challenged the aristocracy of secular government. So Coles was very, very much aware of this. But John Peck was sent by the Baptist sect to St. Louis and eventually Illinois to try to organize Baptists. But he was an outsider. He called it the missionary system that they used to refer to it. The fire and brimstone guys, they didn't like the missionary system too well and didn't like people like Peck. But Peck turned out to be a tremendous, tremendous help. Coles contacted him. He contacted Richard Flowers. He contacted Morris Brickberg. And he began to organize. Key word here. And I think if you look at Coles' background and his experience with politicians, his experience in Europe, he knew how to get things done politically. And so with that going, that started the Freedom Party and started a grassroots movement. Two people that were very, very key in the pro-slavery campaign were a fellow named William Kinney and Theophilus Washington Smith. If I may take about 2 minutes and tell you about William Kinney. William Kinney learned to read when he was 19 years old. He was not very well educated. He accompanied his father in 1797, I believe, to Illinois. They settled at a place near what was then New Design. But Kinney was an ambitious character. He began farming. Then he began selling merchandise for a St. Louis manufacturer. Then he decided he'd get his own salesman and be kind of a middleman broker for several of the businesses in St. Louis. Along the way, he was sued by his niece because he eventually took his sister and cheated her on a tax, on the value of property in a settlement. Her husband had died, and he undervalued the property and put the other stuff in his pocket. So he was kind of an unscrupulous businessman, and he found the path to being a minister, a preacher. That's okay. This is natural. So I'm an unscrupulous businessman. I'm going to be a preacher. Became a fiery Baptist preacher, uneducated. He was one of those that I talked about when I talked about the revivals and these revivals would attract hundreds, if not thousands, of people at a time. These open air revivals. And they would sing and find the Lord and fall down, and it was from that natural process, from unscrupulous businessman to a minister, he decided there was one more transition that was really enacted, and that was politics. So Kinney ran for public office, and he was elected to the Third General Assembly. The assembly that gave us the slave revolution. He was part of the committee that articulated what the goals of the slave revolution, or of the goals of the convention were. And he was called by some of the newspapers the key operative at that time. So he was well known what this guy did. Another guy that is senator, and he was another senator, was Theophilus, however you want to say it, Washington Smith. Senator Smith was a very, very bad guy. Was an attorney, again from New York. Some say Tammany Hall. I don't know. I've seen accusations about that and references to that, but I haven't tied him completely with Tammany Hall that early. But he had a short temper, and would eventually, after the legislature, he was appointed to the Supreme Court, served on the court, was impeached in 1833. I think the only impeachment besides Rod Blagojevich a few years ago. And he would have been convicted, except they needed 2/3. and it was winter, the legislature wasn't in, and Vandalia was not the place you really want to go to have a trial if you don't have to go to Vandalia. So they didn't get 2/3. Smith had a temper problem. He got into a fight with Ninian Edwards during the campaign. He and also, by the way, he also became editor of the Republican Advocate, which was a Republican newspaper in Vandalia. Well, not Republican in today's terms, but yeah. And almost got a broken jaw from Ninian Edwards. In Vandalia, pulled a knife on Hooper Warren, and I'll tell you about him in a minute. Finally was calmed down and taken out. But very fiery character, very active in the campaign, pro-slavery campaign. Hooper Warren is a very interesting character. He is not a legislator. He was a editor of the newspaper, the Spectator, and Warren also was an observer of the 1818 convention, and he had the opportunity, because housing in 1818 in Kaskaskia was pretty slim. So he and Coles, remember Coles? Roomed together for a while. Now, what went on in that room, I don't know. But I know that Cooper Warren hated Edward Coles. He was very much anti-slavery. And so his newspaper, The Spectator, during the campaign was just one editorial after another in favor of refusing to have a convention, of a no vote on the convention. Smith, on the other hand, had the other paper in town, and Smith stood by his pro-slavery views. So that's okay. I talked about the Great Awakening. I want to talk about Peck for a minute. Let me go back. Yes. No, I can't do that. Anyway, I want to go back I want to talk about Peck, because I think I started, but I went off for a moment. John Peck was very, very active in the campaign, had very and basically took the ministers and organized the ministers. And even though there were the Kinneys of the world, and not only Kinney but several other ministers that were pro-slavery, the majority of the religious community were anti-slavery people and got involved in the process, in the campaign. It angered Smith to no avail. In fact, Peck wrote one article that was an editorial, and excuse me. Peck called a meeting that eventually turned into an editorial. But during the meeting, he claimed this about 1855 in a letter to Hooper Warren. But he said that there were about 30 ministers at this meeting. Now, 30 ministers at a meeting in 1823, let me tell you, that's a lot of folks. That's a lot of folks. And it really bothered the pro-slavery people. So Smith wrote an editorial in his paper saying, have we sold out? These are ministers of the gospel, the word of God. and they're doing political stuff, they shouldn't do this. So there was and I said before, there's this sophistication that emerges sometimes. It's rather surprising. The two just argue these back and forth for a while. So very, very interesting. There were really three ways to communicate with the public. All right? Now you organize so you have grassroots, very much like working a precinct today. You have precinct captains if you're from Chicago. I don't know if they have precinct captains in other cities, but somebody whose precinct is your responsibility, and you are responsible for promoting your party in that. Well, so they did do that. They did organize. But the three big ways to communicate are public meetings, pamphlets, and newspapers. And public meetings were usually not discussions. You wouldn't get 50 people together and say, oh, what do you think? You'd get 50 people together and say, this is what we think. And they'd go, yeah. And they would indulge themselves in whiskey and fare and whatnot. And a lot of times the public meetings turned into mob scenes. And I'll tell you about some that happened in Vandalia. Pamphlets were very, very effective, but they were expensive. Mostly the pamphlets, and I've got a couple that I was able to retrieve a few of them from the Lincoln Library, copies of it, that here in fact, that show that level of sophistication. And for a long time, the pro-slavery people were figuring, how are they doing this? How are they getting these pamphlets into, where are they coming from? Because what they would do is put them into other shipments of goods, so you had no idea what the hell was coming in, and then they would open them up and then give them out, and there was no address on them or anything else, just the point. So pamphlets were very, very good, except they were expensive, and then they took some coordination, and they took bright people to write them. And this is where Volk came tremendous. And Coles wrote a couple of the pamphlets. Coles was very, very active. The other way was newspapers. There were 5 newspapers in Illinois at that time. And let's see, there we go. The Republican Advocate, pro-convention, down in Kaskaskia, or open in Kaskaskia. The Edwardsville Spectator, that was Warren's paper. The Edwardsville Republican, that was Smith's paper. The Illinois Intelligencer was an interesting story, and I'll get to that in a second. And then the Illinois Gazette, which is way down in Shawneetown. The Illinois Gazette was next to the Shawneetown saline works, the salt works down there, which are very, very important to the state because it was money. The Spectator was Warren's paper, and it was so you've got 4 papers that are pro-slavery, pro-convention. You got 1, Warren's paper, that says, well, this really bothered. Coles and his people were not dumb. This is really skewed the wrong way. The paper was owned by several of the pro-slavery legislators, but also was run by a fellow named Kinney, and they hired a fellow named Blackboard. Lord, I see I got that on here. I can't go back though. Yeah, I don't have it. And Barry was having trouble. Barry was a state senator, he was a legislator in the Second General Assembly. He was well connected and very pro-slavery. He had an editor by the name of Robert Blackwell, and Blackwell was kind of basically not very politically astute, but he was a good editor. And but Barry had severe financial problems by the spring of 1863 when this whole thing started. And Coles became aware of that. Now, and by the way, at the start of the campaign, Barry got a state contract from the legislature that would print state material. So it was a help, and hired Blackwell. But Barry had a partner also in the beginning, in 1823, in the spring of 1823, by the name of Brown, Robert Brown. And Brown was he was a Freedom Party person. So there was this terrific disagreement between the two. And Brown wrote a blistering editorial on what the legislature had done in passing the Constitutional Convention resolution. And the legislature went crazy. And Barry wrote a response letter saying, I didn't even know this was coming. And the next thing you know, Brown is gone. He's gone. Hire a fellow named Blackwell, who I started to tell you about before. And Blackwell, he would go along with it. So from January, or from, oh my goodness, probably about April of 1823 till about 1824, April of 1824, the intelligentsia was very pro-slavery. But Coles became aware of Barry's financial problems, even with the state contract, and began negotiations with Robert Blackwell to buy out Barry, solve all his problems. This is where money comes. And Barry could go away, and Coles would have editorial support or control of what the intelligentsia printed, which then gave him two papers, the Spectator and the Intelligentsia. It worked. And so now they got to find an editor for the paper. And they picked a guy who was Robert Blackwell's brother. And he was an attorney, really wanted to be a legislator, and just had a bad time of getting elected, and had a young family, was bright, and John Peck, the minister, had a talk with him and said, would you like to be, well, let me go back one a guy named Lipticock was the Supreme Court, or was the Secretary of State, appointed by, when they were appointed. And he resigned. He was very pro Freedom Party person, but he resigned about April of 1823 also. And Coles didn't know who to place in that position. And he negotiated a replacement for a year. And finally, John Mason Peck, the minister, has this talk with Robert Blackbell's brother, David, and says, I'll tell you what, if you'll agree to everything here, Coles gets editorial, you will take an active part being an editor of the Intelligencer. Active part. And by the way, you also be Secretary of State. And he said, I agree to everything. So he became Secretary of State and the editor of the Intelligencer. And so the Intelligencer, from April until probably May to August of 1882, very, very anti-convention, very, very much, and really supported the Spectator very, very much so. So that was a problem that worked out. As I say, the arguments that were presented really didn't change for 18 months. They basically argued the same thing. Basically, this is the new democracy, for gosh sakes. This is freedom. The world isn't. They're watching us. All we have to do is, we're going to change our system here. We're going to modify our convention. It's our right. And the slave party, or the anti-slave party, the Freedom Party, was saying, that's fine, but you really want to institute slavery. Now, about the turn of the year, around 1823 to 1824, they couldn't, the slave party could not ignore slavery anymore. And so what they began to say was, well, even if we did, if that's what the people want, so they can do it. And they thought about the results of the gubernatorial race for this issue. If you took the numbers that voted for the two pro-slavery candidates and the numbers for Cole, for governor, and you added the two pro-slavery candidates together, it's twice as much as Edward Cole. So we've got the votes. Let's go. The election was held, and 67% of the vote went to reject having a convention. That was it. Now, what happened afterwards? Well, I'm all excited because I thought, well, this is, 2024, this has been going on for January 6th, blah, blah. Nothing. The pro-slavery people accepted it. There was nothing like this is cheating, blah, blah, blah. It was 67% is a pretty strong number. So the organization of the religious groups, the communication that they had, the coordination of the communication, it paid off, and we reject it. Now, the counterfactual questions to this event are phenomenal. What about this guy named Abraham Lincoln that came about a decade later, and would he have come to Illinois, and would there? So it's the only election that dealt with slavery that was by the people, there was one area election in Kansas in 1859, if you're familiar with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the bloody Kansas and whatnot. That was the only time that people had to vote yes or no for slavery. And they voted no. So I think it just really, it stands out. It's, why did they vote no? I'm trying to, I have to say basically the presentation, and then also the influx of migrants to Illinois from or after 1819. An awful lot of Eastern people were coming in. So it wasn't I call them uplanders from Tennessee and Kentucky that are here, the William Kinneys. And there was this, and the argument that we can do this and we're free and that actually backfired a little bit because they said, we don't want those, we know what it's like down south, and you see this aristocracy being born. We don't want that. We want every farmer to have the right, not to compete with a bunch of slaves. We want to and so I think basically that was basically it. Any questions?
We get a mic over to you.
Yeah, whatever. So I just have a question about the voting. First of all, I think you said Illinois, this was the only time Illinois was given, the people of Illinois were given the option to vote with regards to slavery or not slavery. Is that correct?
That's to the best that I could find, that is correct.
Do you know if any other state in the country had where the people had the opportunity to vote?
Yes, that was one of my great questions too. And the only place that I could find was Kansas.
Kansas?
Mm-hmm. And it was that dealt with basically the bloody Kansas, 1859, I think.
Okay.
And if you look at that,
okay,
there was, by the way, if I could tell you the results of that, they refused slavery, but they wouldn't give women any rights at all.
Well, I know that women were not, the Constitution says all men are free and equal, but I know women were not allowed to vote. I understand that. I understand if you were a black man, you were not allowed to vote, correct? So
Well, until the Civil War.
Right.
Until the 14th Amendment.
But I heard that they also put stipulations on other people who couldn't vote. If you had to be educated, is that right?
No, not in Illinois.
Yeah, a owner? Did you have to be a landowner? That's not true?
Mm-mm. Read the Constitution.
Is that?
I refer to the Constitution.
Wait a minute. Okay. Say, in Illinois, that was not true for Illinois.
Right.
But was that true for other states?
I don't.
Okay.
To me, to say it, I can't back myself up on it. I don't know every state.
I guess where I'm going is I heard recently that it was when our country was started that the people who started it did not want, they still wanted aristocracy to be, the people who made the decisions, and if you weren't educated, then you didn't get to have a vote.
Oh, sure.
And if you didn't own land, you didn't get to have a vote.
Sure. A great book is called The Great Debate, and it's by Yuval Levin, I think and you see him on C-SPAN a lot. And The Great Debate is Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine. And that is really articulated very well in that book, one of my favorite books, The Great Debate.
The Great Debate?
Yes. And
okay.
so, yeah.
So at least here in Illinois, landowner, not just landowners, but farmers and uneducated people,
Right.
et cetera, were, the only people who were excluded were the slaves and the women, yes?
Right.
Okay,
Right.
all right, thank you.
Any other questions?
So
Here you go.
what were the, so how were the votes counted? Did they go back to the counties or to the legislature?
Yeah, they went to, the votes were actually counted locally, and then given to the legislature. But the legislature they could decide what was, someone said, like Shaw said, use my votes, not his votes. But the legislature was the final arbitrator, yeah.
All right, any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? Right over here.
Well, the question I was going to ask and I was thinking about the whole time was actually one that you mentioned. So do you think if Illinois had this convention and maybe became a slave state, do you think it would have affected whether Lincoln came here? And do you have any thoughts about that?
I should, my good friend is a friend of mine is Michael Burlingame. And I think Michael's one of the best Lincoln scholars around. And I don't know. It would be difficult. And I don't know when. I think Michael said that we don't know when Lincoln's slavery aspects came about. If they were always there, if they were not always there. But it certainly would have changed the numbers in the legislature. And that's, this is a slave state. And Missouri is a slave state. Are you crazy? You people in New York, are you nuts? Massachusetts. So, interesting.
Ladies and gentlemen, please again, Bernie Sieracki.